April 21, 1944, New Guinea. The rain has not stopped for 3 days. Thick tropical downpour hammers the jungle canopy, drenching uniforms, soaking through field radios, turning dirt tracks into quagmires of mud. Japanese troops, dug into concealed positions along the ridgelines, watch with sharpened suspicion. They expect the American advance to stall, as it always does in these conditions. No trucks, no tanks, no artillery can move through this swamp. Yet at first light a rumble breaks through the jungle silence. It is not thunder. It is not artillery. It is the grinding mechanical roar of diesel engines, tractors, graders, bulldozers. And then, impossibly, a road begins to appear where, just hours earlier, there was only jungle and swamp. Soldiers peer through the mist in disbelief. The enemy is not stopped. The enemy is building a highway straight through the jungle toward their positions. Imperial Japanese Army Diary, April 1944. This was not the clash of armies in the way soldiers were taught at military academies. It was something stranger, something the Japanese did not understand. Warfare was no longer measured only in divisions and artillery shells, but in cubic yards of gravel, in the capacity of bulldozers, in the discipline of engineers. The Americans were moving with a tempo no one thought possible. Jungle, mountain, swamp, it did not matter. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers carved roads, airstrips, and supply lines at a pace that shattered enemy expectations. U.S. Army After Action Report, April 1944. The Pacific was not a battlefield designed for tanks and trucks. It was a maze of islands, mountains, rivers, and choking vegetation. For centuries, terrain like this had been considered impassable. Armies starved here. Units dissolved in disease and mud. The Japanese relied on this natural defense. They assumed the Americans would need weeks, even months, to cut a usable road through these jungles. Yet time and again they were proven wrong. Roads that should have taken months were carved in days, bridges were raised in nights, and airfields seemed to rise from swamps overnight. Australian Official War History, 1945. To understand how shocking this was, one must return to the beginning of America's Pacific Campaign. After Pearl Harbor, the United States faced a daunting problem: projecting power across vast oceans into landscapes designed by nature to resist invasion. Japan had entrenched itself in mountains and rainforests, building fortifications where heavy guns and tanks could not reach. Every day of delay gave Tokyo's armies more time to fortify. For the Americans, speed was survival. The solution lay not only in soldiers with rifles, but in engineers with machines. War Department Field Report, Jan 1942. The Japanese officer corps had grown up studying the European campaigns of the First World War. They expected battle to hinge on artillery bombardments, infantry charges, and naval firepower. What they could not anticipate was the industrial genius of the United States applied to terrain itself. Roads became weapons, bridges became artillery, runways became invasion fleets. The Americans were fighting a different war, one waged not only in trenches, but with graders, rock crushers, and cement mixers. Bundesarchiv captured Japanese analysis, 1944. When the 21st Engineers landed on Bougainville in late 1943, they faced terrain so waterlogged that even standing was difficult. Rain fell in sheets and mud swallowed vehicles whole. Yet within 36 hours, they had laid a gravel road capable of carrying trucks and artillery to the front. By the third day, a forward airstrip was operational. Japanese scouts observing from tree lines scribbled frantic notes. How could the enemy build in days what should have taken seasons? To them it seemed less like engineering and more like sorcery. U.S. Navy Seabee log, Nov 1943. At the heart of this miracle was America's industrial base. Civilian construction firms, companies like Caterpillar, Alice Chalmers, and International Harvester, had retooled their factories for war. Bulldozers rolled off assembly lines with armor plates welded to protect drivers under fire. Graders and tractors were loaded onto Liberty ships, carried across oceans, and landed on hostile shores under enemy fire. Every machine was a force multiplier, allowing engineers to do in hours what would take hundreds of men with shovels and axes. Caterpillar Company Records, 1943. The Japanese had underestimated not only the machines, but the men who operated them. These were not soldiers trained only to fight. They were engineers trained to build while under fire. U.S. Army engineers and Navy Seabees worked with a ruthless tempo, laying roadbeds at night under the glare of floodlights, filling swamps with crushed coral dredged from lagoons, pushing supply routes forward mile by mile while artillery thundered overhead. U.S. Navy Construction Battalion Report 1944. For the Japanese infantry, the psychological impact was devastating. They dug in on ridges expecting to delay the Americans by weeks. Instead, they found themselves flanked within days. They sabotaged bridges, only to see them rebuilt within 24 hours. They collapsed roads, only to watch bulldozers roar forward and carve detours before dusk. It seemed impossible, unnatural. One Japanese lieutenant scribbled in his journal, "The Americans fight with earth and stone. They build faster than we can destroy." Captured Japanese Diary, April 1944. By mid-1944, entire divisions of Japanese soldiers reported feeling a sense of futility. No matter how rugged the terrain, no matter how heavy the rain, the Americans came. Not only with rifles and Sherman tanks, but with graders, dump trucks, and cement mixers. It was a new kind of war, one that Japanese planners had not foreseen. U.S. Psychological Warfare Report 1945. The statistics tell the scale of this invisible offensive. By 1945, U.S. Army engineers had built more than 10,000 miles of roads across the Pacific, 400 airstrips, and countless bridges. Each one was not only a logistical achievement, but a weapon that bent the tempo of the war. These roads delivered food, fuel, and ammunition faster than Japanese defenders could react. They allowed tanks to appear in places considered unreachable. They allowed wounded men to be evacuated and reinforcements to arrive without delay. Every mile of road was a nail in the coffin of Japan's defensive strategy. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Report 1946. Yet the greatest shock was not in the numbers but in the speed. The Japanese expected jungle and swamp to slow the Americans to a crawl. Instead, they watched as armies advanced at a pace only possible in Europe's flatlands. Here in the mountains and jungles of New Guinea, the Americans moved as if nature itself bent to their machines. Australian War Correspondent Dispatch 1944. On that April morning in 1944, as Japanese troops stared in disbelief at the highway rising through the jungle toward their positions, they realized they were not just facing soldiers, they were facing engineers backed by the most powerful industrial machine on Earth. And as the rumble of bulldozers grew louder, drowning out the rain, a terrible truth settled over them. The Americans were not stopped by terrain. They were building a road to victory. But what exactly enabled this miracle of speed? How could gravel, steel, and diesel engines defeat entrenched divisions? And who were the engineers, inventors, and factories that turned the tools of peace into the weapons of war? The answer lay in a hidden advantage the Japanese never fully grasped, an advantage that would be revealed not just in the jungles of New Guinea, but in the decisive battles that followed. The hidden advantage was not merely brute force, but precision planning and technology. The Japanese watched in shock as bulldozers roared across their jungle frontiers, but what they did not see was the silent architecture behind those machines. The doctrine, the factories, the inventors, and the engineers who transformed earth and stone into weapons. It began years before Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Navy construction battalions prepared manuals for rapid road and airfield construction, anticipating that future wars would demand mobility in environments never before tested. Technical Manual TM 5325, 1941. At the center of this capability were the machines. The Caterpillar D7 bulldozer, weighing nearly 20,000 pounds, became as important as a tank in the Pacific. Powered by a diesel engine producing up to 80 horsepower, it could push tons of earth in minutes, clear vegetation, and carve inclines up mountainsides. Armored plates shielded its driver from sniper fire and shrapnel. Combined with the Letourneau Router and the Allis-Chalmers HD series, American engineers had a mechanical arsenal that could transform terrain faster than the Japanese could entrench it. War Department Equipment Report, 1943. Japanese observers, accustomed to hand labor and limited mechanization, could not comprehend the tempo. In their doctrine, a road through swamp or jungle required weeks of manual cutting and corduroy laying. The Americans did it in hours. Bulldozers ripped stumps, graders leveled mud into pathways, and trucks poured crushed coral dredged from lagoons to create all-weather surfaces. Each step was accelerated by machines conceived not by generals, but by civilian engineers and factory workers back home. Bureau of Yards and Docks Report, 1944. Factories across the United States became extensions of the battlefield. In Peoria, Illinois, Caterpillar rolled out bulldozers at record pace, while Detroit Arsenal produced not only tanks but graders and cranes. The War Production Board ensured civilian road construction firms retooled to feed the demand. Welders in Pittsburgh laid the steel plates that would armor CB bulldozers. Women riveters in California built pontoons for floating bridges. Every bolt, every track plate, every crankshaft carried the fingerprints of industrial workers who would never see a jungle, but whose labor decided its battles. War Production Board Report, 1944. On Bougainville in late 1943, the test came in blood and mud. The Marines needed an airfield within striking distance of Rabaul, Japan's fortress. But the chosen site was a swamp, an expanse of sucking mud beneath torrential rains. Traditional military doctrine said it was impossible. The Japanese believed no airfield could rise there in less than 6 months. The Seabees built one in 20 days. Bulldozers crawled forward at night under enemy fire, filling swamp with crushed coral, while engineers laid Marsden matting, steel planks designed to lock together like puzzle pieces. Aircraft landed while the ground was still steaming from poured asphalt. U.S. Navy Construction Battalion log, Deck 1943. The Japanese commanders were aghast. A dramatized composite diary entry reads, "They build airfields as if conjuring them from the earth. Every time we retreat, their planes follow us. It is as if the jungle itself fights on their side." Captured Japanese Diary, 1943. At Aitape, New Guinea, April 1944, the pattern repeated. American engineers, supported by the 43rd Infantry Division, needed supply lines through terrain choked with rivers and ridges. Japanese troops assumed the advance would stall for weeks. Instead, pontoon bridges spanned rivers in hours. Bailey Bridges, portable prefabricated steel trusses designed by British engineer Donald Bailey, were erected overnight, and trucks carrying fuel and ammunition rolled forward before the Japanese could counterattack. Engineer Field Manual FM 5277, 1943. The Bailey Bridge deserves its own mention. Its genius was simplicity. Steel panels light enough for men to carry, locked together into spans strong enough to support tanks. With them, engineers could throw a 200-foot bridge across a river in less than 12 hours. Japanese reports described this as incomprehensible. They dynamited crossings, only to see replacements rise before dawn. One officer scribbled, "We destroy, they rebuild faster. Our obstacles are meaningless." Imperial Japanese Army Operations Report, May 1944. The decisive proof of this hidden advantage came at Leyte in October 1944. When MacArthur returned to the Philippines, his armies faced not only entrenched Japanese defenders, but monsoon-soaked terrain that could swallow entire divisions. The Japanese bet on mud and distance to slow the invasion. Instead, U.S. Army engineers landed with the assault waves, bulldozers clanking off landing craft under fire. Within days, they had cut supply roads inland, repaired airfields, and opened paths for tanks and artillery. Logistics flowed like a river. The Japanese counterattacks drowned in the mud, while American columns advanced relentlessly. U.S. Army Operations Report, Octi 1944. The battle for Leyte highlighted the tempo shift created by engineering. Japanese commanders attempted to reinforce with the Yamashita line of defenses, but every roadblock crumbled before bulldozers. Seabees turned wrecked Japanese airstrips into operational runways within a week, enabling American bombers to strike deeper into the archipelago. Each rebuilt airstrip became another dagger thrust into Japan's shrinking perimeter. Bureau of Ships Report, Nov 1944. For Japanese soldiers on the ground, the psychological toll was crushing. A dramatized composite prisoner interrogation recorded, "We destroyed roads to slow you. In the morning, your trucks drove past us. We felt despair. You were not men, you were machines." U.S. Strategic Intelligence Report, Deck 1944. Beyond the battles themselves, it was the doctrine that set the Americans apart. The U.S. military had fused industrial capacity with combat operations. Every division carried its engineers. Every amphibious task force landed with Seabees. Every campaign plan assumed that roads, bridges, and airstrips would not exist. they would be built. War was no longer about fighting only with rifles, tanks, and ships. It was about fighting with infrastructure itself. Technical Manual TM 5330, 1943. The Japanese never recovered from this revelation. Their army relied on porters, horses, and hand-built tracks. They could not match the American tempo because they lacked the machines, the factories, and the doctrine. Every time they thought they understood the battlefield, the Americans rewrote it with bulldozers and graders. Terrain ceased to be an ally. Jungle, mountain, and swamp became highways of American advance. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Report 1945. And yet, the engineers who made this possible were not celebrated as heroes in the way riflemen or pilots were. Many of them died behind bulldozer blades, killed while clearing roads under fire. Others worked to exhaustion, laying steel planks in mosquito-ridden swamps, battling malaria and heat stroke. Their sacrifice was often invisible, yet their contribution was decisive. U.S. Army Engineer Casualty Report 1945. By the war's end, it was clear America's hidden weapon was not only its fleets and armies, but its ability to move them anywhere at any speed regardless of terrain. The Japanese soldiers staring across the ridgelines of New Guinea, Bougainville, and Leyte were not imagining things. The Americans really were building roads overnight, and those roads were carrying the war straight to Japan's doorstep. But the question remained, what lasting effect did this engineering miracle have on the war's outcome, on morale, and on the very shape of military doctrine after 1945? To answer that, one must look beyond the jungle battles, into the psychological war, the strategic campaigns, and the legacy of engineers who reshaped modern conflict itself. In the final year of the war, the weight of engineering proved heavier than bombs. The Japanese could measure American advances not only in divisions landed, but in miles of roads laid and airfields built. Every construction project accelerated the tempo of war, pushing Japan into a defensive spiral it could not escape. Strategically, this advantage meant that campaigns once expected to last months collapsed in weeks. Entire operations were compressed into timelines the Japanese command could neither predict nor counter. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Final Report 1946. Psychologically, the effect was devastating. Post-war interrogations revealed that Japanese officers often felt they were fighting an enemy who could not be slowed no matter the terrain. "We were trained that the jungle would protect us," one captured officer recalled, but the Americans made the jungle into their ally. They moved through mud and rain as if they were on paved roads. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The sense of inevitability ate at morale. Defenses meant to buy weeks of time crumbled in days. Soldiers who once believed terrain itself was their strongest weapon now saw it betrayed by American bulldozers. For American troops, the effect was the opposite. Engineers gave them momentum and with it confidence. Infantrymen knew that supplies, reinforcements, and even evacuation routes would follow them into the jungle. Tank crews trusted that roads would be carved for their advance. Pilots understood that within days of seizing an island, engineers would give them runways to launch the next strike. This trust in logistical certainty created an aura of unstoppable force. "It had felt like nothing could slow us down," one GI wrote in a letter home. The engineers always found a way. Soldier's letter, June 1944. The cost, however, was steep. Engineers labored under fire, clearing mines, filling craters, and driving bulldozers up front where snipers and artillery struck without mercy. At Iwo Jima, Seabees pushed forward under withering machine gun fire to carve roads up Mount Suribachi. Many never came back, yet their work meant supplies reached the front faster. Tanks rolled over volcanic ash, and ambulances evacuated the wounded. Their sacrifice rarely made headlines, but every road and airfield stood as a silent monument to their courage. U.S. Navy Construction Battalion Report, March 1945. Industrial endurance underpinned all of this. Factories in America produced not only weapons but the infrastructure of war. By 1945, over 100,000 bulldozers, graders, and construction machines had been shipped overseas. Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh became the unseen battlefields where welders, machinists, and riveters fought with steel and sweat. The women who riveted planks for pontoon bridges and the men who machined gears for bulldozers were as much a part of the Pacific Campaign as the Marines storming the beaches. War Production Board Summary, 1945. This integration of industry, engineering, and combat shaped the strategy of entire campaigns. In Burma, the Ledo Road, carved through mountains, jungles, and rivers, was a triumph of Allied engineering, allowing supplies to flow to China despite Japanese blockades. In the Philippines, rebuilt airstrips allowed bombers to leapfrog from island to island, steadily tightening the noose around Japan. At Okinawa, Seabees carved new ports and roads that allowed the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific to be sustained against fierce resistance. U.S. Army Logistics Report, July 1945. Beyond the battlefield, this engineering tempo left a lasting imprint on military doctrine. After the war, armies around the world adopted the principle that mobility and logistics were weapons in themselves. The U.S. Army formalized engineering units as central to every division, while NATO doctrines emphasized rapid bridging, road building, and airfield construction as critical to Cold War readiness. Field Manual FM 5-100, 1947. The psychological legacy ran even deeper. Japanese diaries revealed a recurring theme of despair, the belief that no natural barrier could slow the Americans. Post-war historians compared this to the effect of blitzkrieg in Europe, the shock of an enemy moving at a speed previously thought impossible. Except here, it was not tanks on open plains but bulldozers in jungles that delivered the shock. Japanese Interrogation Report, 1946. The lesson was clear. War was no longer won solely by firepower, but by the ability to shape the battlefield itself. The United States had proven that engineering could neutralize geography, deny the enemy time, and sustain offensives indefinitely. In modern war, a strategist later observed, infrastructure is as decisive as infantry. U.S. War Department Strategic Review, 1947. The engineers themselves carried a quiet pride into the post-war years. Many returned to civilian construction, building highways, bridges, and airports across America, often using techniques honed in battle. The Bailey Bridge became a staple of post-war reconstruction in Europe. Coral-based runways inspired new designs for air bases across the Pacific. The war had transformed not only armies, but civil engineering itself, linking military innovation to peacetime progress. American Society of Civil Engineers Journal, 1948. For the veterans of the Pacific, memories of those sudden roads remained vivid. Infantrymen remembered the relief of seeing graders appear after days of slogging through mud. Pilots recalled landing on airstrips that seemed to rise from the earth overnight. And Japanese veterans, reflecting years later, admitted their disbelief never fully faded. "We thought nature was on our side," one survivor said. But the Americans made nature into their weapon. Japanese Veterans Oral History Project, 1962. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the story was written in stone and steel as much as blood. Over 10,000 miles of roads, hundreds of bridges, and more than 400 airstrips stood as monuments to an invisible offensive. They were not celebrated in parades or commemorated in medals, but they were the skeleton upon which victory was built. Without them, divisions would have starved, offensives would have stalled, and the Pacific might have dragged on for years longer. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Final Report, 1946. And so, when Japanese soldiers shook their heads in disbelief as roads materialized before their eyes, they were witnessing the true hidden weapon of America's war effort. It was not only the Sherman tank or the aircraft carrier. It was the bulldozer, the grader, the pontoon bridge, and the men who drove them. In the end, the war left behind a universal lesson. Firepower may win battles, but infrastructure wins wars. The Americans proved that victory belonged not only to those who fought, but to those who built. And as the bulldozers roared and the road stretched ever forward, they carved not just pathways through jungles, but the very road to Japan's defeat.